And this is episode 3. And real quick, before we dive into all the details, I just want to make a quick announcement. Those that have listened to the podcast so far will already know this, but it never hurts to say it twice or 3 times or 4 times or 5 times. But that is basically all of these podcasts are live streamed on my YouTube, DLive, and Twitch. And my YouTube and DLive are Roundtable Decision, and my Twitch is Roundtable Talk. And after I do these live streams, I then publish it onto publish a version onto podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you might find your podcast. So that's kind of the idea of it. But if you ever want to kind of catch the podcast live, you can follow my Discord channel or my Twitter, and I tend to announce when I'm going to be doing the live stream if you want to catch it and have your comments during the actual podcast itself. But that's real quick. And before I dive into the topics at hand today, I wanted to give a quick shout out to Freedom Scoop. Freedom Scoop is a network of content creators, and we all kind of just do our own versions of podcast or commentary with Stephen Ingaramus, Ed from Ed's Ward, and I think Ed's Ward's gone now, but he does his contemporary every morning, and he has a show he hosts with his co-host now. And then we have the Generational Gap that is every Monday and Friday, and R-Rated Conservative on DLive and others. And thank you, Ed, for the diamond. I appreciate that real quick. And so that's basically who we are at Freedom Scoop. We're just a bunch of independent content creators that try to understand political issues and give more perspective than just what you hear with the mainstream media. So we have a lot of topics that I want to talk about today, and I don't know if this episode's going to be as long as the other episodes, as there wasn't too much information for all of them. And hello, John on YouTube. But I just wanted to quickly dive in with some of the main topics that I thought I found interesting or are interesting, but whatever you want to word that. And the first one was the NRA, but we're also going to be talking about the explosion, Michelle Obama, the former First Lady, and the Pope, and some of his other announcements that he's made so far in the Catholics debate. Because those, I guess what I was wanting to say quickly there was Pope Francis is the Pope, obviously, of the Catholic Church, and kind of the head figure of that platform. And I'll talk about it a little bit more once I get to that topic. But he is a kind of a controversial figure within that role of being Pope. But I don't want to waste all my information or what I want to say on that too early on. So I'll kind of just dive on into the first topic, which was the NRA. And this article is by Siona Malgi. The New York Attorney General files lawsuit to dissolve the National Rifle Association. The New York Attorney General Letitia James announced she will attempt to dissolve the National Rifle Association, accusing its senior leadership of violating laws governing nonprofit groups, using millions from the organization reserves for personal use and tax fraud. In a news release Tuesday morning, James, a Democrat, alleged that a current and former NRA leadership has instituted a culture of self-dealing mismanagement, benefiting themselves from family, friends, and favored vendors, leading the organization to lose more than $63 million in 3 years. The NRA's influence has been so powerful that the organization went unchecked for decades, while top executives fondled millions into their own pockets, James said in a news release. James' office filed the suit Tuesday morning in the New York Supreme Court. It names the NRA CEO and Executive Vice President Wayne LaPierce, General Counsel and Secretary John Fraser, former Chief Financial Officer Wilson Woody Phillips, and former Chief of Staff and Executive Director of General Operations Josh Powell. While the NRA has headquarters in the Northern Virginia suburbs outside of Washington, D.C., the organization has opted as a New York-registered 501c4 group since 1871, the news release said. The lawsuit marks an ambiguous attempt by James to end one of the nation's most influential interest groups, one that has played an outside role in Republican politics. The NRA reports it has about 5 million members across the country and works to defund Americans' Second Amendment right to bear arms, and has turned increasingly political in recent years, particularly in its political operations support of President Donald Trump. James accuses the NRA of violating multiple laws, including false reporting of annual fillings with the IRS and the New York Chambers of Bureau, improperly documenting expenses, improper wage and income tax, reporting and exclusively paying people for work for which they were not qualified. So this article goes on a little bit more, and I have other articles talking about the NRA as well, but I just wanted to quickly interrupt with my thoughts before we get right on into the next articles and such. But as it said that the NRA has increasingly gotten political, I would argue that necessarily yes, if you think of a very short-term explanation of that. And basically what I mean by that is, yes, they have gotten political, but then I ask, why have they gotten political? Was it their own motives that made them political, or was it outside type of motives that convinced them to become political, if that makes any sense? And then again, what I mean by that one is basically, is it people wanting or shouting out the NRA for what they think they're doing, and then the NRA responds, and therefore they give their political stance of that issue? Or did the NRA do something and then somebody reacted to what they did? Or is it a mixture of both? I would say that it is probably most likely a mixture of both. But the NRA isn't exactly a group that is well liked from the left-leaning type of politics people, and people that generally think that guns aren't something every American should have, or guns are something we should be more afraid of than the average American might be. And the Second Amendment rights have become an increasingly large issue over the mass shootings that have happened in other events. And in general, you have the people that don't think that guns are useful and should be used. And then you have the people that say that although guns might be scary or whatever else you might want to say guns are, we still should be allowed to have guns for self-defense and our Second Amendment rights, which is the right to bear arms, that we are all aware of. But I remember, and I don't know too much about the NRA as a whole leadership program. I wouldn't say that I'm an expert of the NRA. I don't want to say that I necessarily know too much about gun laws as a whole either. But from the little I know of each, it is interesting to kind of tell this article and how they approach the NRA and being. And I remember hearing Donald Trump basically say the essence of that the NRA should move to Texas due to its tax laws and probably more general acceptance of the program rather than being based in New York. And I see Ed here with some comments. And Ed says, don't forget that... Stop. Okay, don't forget to talk about the fucking blue balls that the whole of the left-wing Twitter has now. They all thought this was going to be the silver bullet that takes out Trump. Yeah, that's kind of a big thing. And that was kind of a side note to this whole issue. And like I said briefly before, I don't know too much about the NRA as a whole organization. But to think that through to Donald Trump backing the NRA or saying that they should move to Texas or whatever else Donald Trump might have said about the NRA, and to think that that's going to be his downfall after everything else they have tried is rather funny to me. And real quick before I move on and forget, all these articles that I have are going to be in the description on my YouTube channel and in the description of wherever you might be listening to the podcast in case you want to read them or follow along yourself. So this next one is from Fox News, and it's New York Attorney General seeks to dissolve the NRA in new lawsuit. And a lot of these articles kind of say the same thing, but I think it's very important we provide different perspectives, or at least look into different perspectives, just to kind of get a full outcome of the thoughts of what's happening or what has happened. The New York Attorney General, Leetta James, announced Thursday that her office has filed a lawsuit against the National Rifle Association, the NRA, and its leadership, including the executive vice president. James issued that the organization of having a culture of self-dealing, taking out millions of dollars for personal use and granting contracts that benefited leaders, families, and associates. So again, we have kind of the same sort of language off from our previous article, as it goes on. For nearly 3 decades, Wayne LaPierce has served as the chief executive officer of the NRA and has exploited the organization for its financial benefit and its benefit of a close circle NRA staff, board members, and vendors of the 163-page complaint states. The Washington, D.C. Attorney General Office also sued the NRA on Thursday based on similar allegations. The New York lawsuit alleges that LaPierce's former chief of staff, Joshua Powell, former CEO William Woody Phillips, and general counsel John Fraser engaged in self-dealing and ignored conflicts of interest in violation of the NRA policy. Alleged conflicts included granting millions of dollars worth of contracts to companies like information technology firm Home Telos, which CEO has a personal relationship with Phillips, who was not disclosed at that time. This was later reported by staff members of Phillips who acted as whistleblowers in 2018. The lawsuit also details personal expenses for which LaPierce was allegedly reimbursed by the NRA. These included private air travel for him and his family and gifts to friends on top of millions of dollars for personal and home security. The lawsuit also claims that LaPierce hired Phillips, Powell, and Fraser despite their lack of skills or experience for their respective roles and responsibilities. And I'll quickly read Ed's comments here. As Ed says, No, they thought the press conference was going to reveal of the allegedly in Trump's business, since Deutsche Bank is being investigated. Yeah, I wasn't aware of that. I've looked at several articles and tried to understand the issue of this conflict more than I did before, but obviously I must have missed that part of the argument of why they think that might take Trump down. And then Ed also says by New York right now too. Oh, I think I read that already. But they're getting investigated by New York and other committees, it seems. So yeah, I was unaware of that. But even then, I don't necessarily think that makes too much of sense if that's going to take Trump down. I think you're going to need something a little bit more than that if you want to take Donald Trump down, with it getting related to personal business and the NRA or anything else that might have been issued from it. Additionally, the complaint alleges that the NRA filed false reports with the New York Attorney General Office and the IRS, specifically regarding compensation to LaPierce, Phillips, Powell, and Fraser. In addition to asking for the organization to be dissolved, James' office seeks to have LaPierce and Fraser removed from their positions, and a declaration from the court saying that directors or members in control of the NRA have looted or wasted the NRA's charitable assets, have reputed the corporation solely for their personal benefit, or have otherwise acted in an illegal, oppressive, or fraudulent manner. The NRA's influence has been so powerful that the organization went unchecked for decades, while top executives funnels millions into their own pockets, James said in a statement. The NRA is fraught with fraud and abuse, which is why today we seek to dissolve the NRA, because no organization is above the law. So obviously, if the NRA has done what has been claimed by several officials and several people who are investigating the NRA, it is a wrongful thing to align your pockets with personal interest. So essentially, you can't have insider trade information. I think it's a good example, or at least an example I thought of in relating to what was getting talked about here. And obviously, I don't think that it involves everything and is an example that works 100% for what is getting talked about here. But basically, you can't have information that no one else has and then use that to your advantage when it comes to politics. And in politics as well, you can't have an organization that does the same thing through motives or through passing laws just for personal interest in that way. But obviously, lobbyists and other groups like it and events like this have always happened throughout history in America, and there is countless examples of fraud in the United States and in other components of the world. So, but I don't necessarily think that what is going on, or at least what I understand of going on in this NRA issue, is going to come down as a major topic or major concern unless more information comes out. This is pretty early on into the investigation, and there isn't really too much concrete details. It's more just about what people have said has happened, and we're kind of going off of that right now. There's not too much physical evidence, or at least evidence that I'm willing to fully agree or disagree with as of yet. It's more just kind of a brief summary of what has happened rather than an actual detailed perspective. And we're going to go to this next topic, and this next topic is probably the biggest topic despite the Biden and Trump news I have a little bit later, and that is the explosion of this Russian ship with ammonium nitrate. And I have several articles kind of talking about what exactly has happened, and I remember Ed mentioned it on his gaming stream, or at least it got mentioned on his gaming stream. He didn't talk about it too much there, but he got me interested in looking at it because I wasn't aware of the explosion beforehand with the commenter and Ed from his gaming stream. And thank you, Rod, for the follow on DLive. I really appreciate that. So this is from CNN by Barry and Katie and Ali. And I'm not going to try their last names because that is going to get butchered. Okay, here we go. As Lebanese investigation into the devastating blast in Beirut continues, officials have pointed to a possible cause: a massive shipment of agriculture fertilizer that authorities say was stored in port of Beirut without safety precautions for years. Gotta love dyslexia when it comes to that. Documents newly reviewed by CNN reveal that the shipment was 2,750 metric tons of aluminum nitrate, arrived on a Russian-owned vessel in 2013. The ship, named the MV Rosis, was designed for... Let's repeat this. Let's start off. As Lebanese investigation into the devastating blast in Beirut continues, officials have pointed to a possible cause: a massive shipment of agricultural fertilizer that authorities say was stored in the port of Beirut without safety precautions for years, despite warnings by local officials. Documents nearly reviewed by CNN revealed that the shipment of 2,750 metric tons of aluminum nitrate arrived in Beirut on a Russian-owned vessel in 2013. The ship, named MV Roses, was designed for but stopped in Beirut due to financial difficulties that also created unrest in the ship's Russia and Ukrainian crew. Once the ship arrived, the ship never left Beirut port, according to Lebanon's Director of Customs, despite repeated warnings by him that others of the cargo was equivalent of a floating bomb. Due to the extreme danger posed by stored items in unsustainable climate conditions, we retire our request to the port authorities to re-export the goods immediately to maintain the safety of the port, those working in it, wrote Dasher President Shavik Marie wrote in a 2016 letter addressed to the judge involved in the case. Lebanese authorities have not yet named the MV Roas as the source of the substance that unanimously exploded in Beirut on Tuesday, but Prime Minister Hossein Dabai said that the devastating blast was caused by 2,750 tons of ammonium nitrate. He added that the substance had been stored for 6 years at the port warehouse without safety measures. And real quick, before I continue on, I was just thinking, why would you have that much of agricultural fertilizer or ammonium nitrate stored on a ship that is extremely highly explosive due to as it said here, unsanitized or climate controlled setting. So basically, as it was stated in the quote, it is a floating bomb. And I don't really understand why you would need that much of it unless it was a quick trip. Like, obviously, you're able to, through ships, airplanes, or whatever else means of driving, whatever else of transportation, you're able to transport these explosive type of items and it be safe and it not result in massive damage, or every bomb that would be transported in the military or whatever else would explode. But then again, if you have something that is potentially highly explosive and has been sitting for years, it's kind of like a volcano that's active. The volcano is going to erupt at some point. It may be a while from now, it may not be, but at some point it is going to explode. So that's kind of the whole point and what's getting investigated. And all of these articles are talking about the similar thing about why it was there, are the facts behind of what we know now. And Trump has gone out to say at one point that it was an attack because it seemed more like a bomb and a direct threat to what has happened. And he quoted military officials telling him that. But at the same time, a lot of people talk about how in the government say that they don't know where Trump heard that and they don't think that it was a on accident they don't think that it was on purpose, but it rather could have been an accident. But we don't really have too much information yet, so we can't say 100% exactly what the motive was or exactly what it was for. But I'll continue on. Lebanon's general security chief also said a highly explosive material had been confiscated years earlier and stored in the warehouse, which is just a few minutes' walk from Beirut's shopping and nightlife districts. Tuesday's massive explosion, which rocked the capital, left at least 135 dead and 5,000 injured. On Wednesday, Lebanese Information Minister Memal Abdel Samad said that there are 3 paper and documents dating back 2014 providing the existence of an exchange of information about the material confiscated by Lebanese authorities. She told Jordan's state-owned channel Al Makim that the exchange is being considered in relation to the potential cause of the deadly Beirut blast. Asked in a telephone interview if there was early findings in an investigation relating to the cause of the explosion, she said there are no primary results of clarification. And in this image, those who are listening live and not watching here, that essentially is talking about the explosion location and how far it went out and what's relating to that effort, or what's beside it. So basically it has the explosion location, then 1 kilometer away, 2 kilometers away, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and certain events of where things were, such as the presidential palace being about 7 kilometers away, and the airport being just over 8 kilometers away. So it kind of talks about that a little bit as well. But I'll continue on from this article a little bit more, and then we'll move on to the next one. In 2013, the MV Bros set off from Benham, Georgia, designed for Mezabaki. I don't know why I can't say that. I heard it about 1,000 times today. But according to the vessel's path and an account of its captain, Boris, it was carrying 2,750 metric tons of ammonium nitrate, an industrial chemical commonly used around the world as fertilizer and an explosives for mining. The Moldovan flagship stopped in Greece to refuel. That's when the ship's owner told the Russian and Ukrainian sellers that it had ran out of money and that they need to pick up additional cargo to cover the travel costs, which led them on a detour to Beirut. And thank you, Ron, for vote for Joe, let your mind go. I've always told you that you need to make that as a t-shirt. I think you would become a multi-billionaire from that t-shirt. You would mega rich. Mega. The vessel was owned by a company called Teto Shipping, which members of the crew said was owned by Iger and Kazakhstan or Kavaspak businessman who resided in Cyprus. I knew this was going to be a tough read, but we'll continue. Once in Beirut, the MV Morris was designed by local port authorities due to gross violations in operating a vessel, unpaid fees to port, and complaints filed by the Russian and Ukrainian crew, according to Seafarers Union of Russia. And it talks a little bit more about details and some warnings from it as well. But I'm going to go to the next article that also talks about the explosion from Fox News. As it says, Beirut explosion linked to Russia ship shorted storing ammonium nitrate left in port called floating bomb. Investigators probing the devastation blast in Beirut killed at least 135 people and injured 5,000 more, are pointing to a Russian ship docked in the city's port for nearly 7 years without appropriate safety precautions that officials warned was a floating bomb. The Russian vessel named MV Roas, carrying agricultural fertilizer with 2,750 metric tons of ammonium nitrate and an en route to Mezabake, hit a financial sag and docked in the Beirut port in 2013, according to legal documents. Lebanese Director of Customs repeatedly sent letters to the judiciary over the years and warned that the cargo was the equivalent of a floating bomb, but the warnings went unheeded. Devere repeatedly asked officials to remove the ammonium nitrate from the port because it was posed a significant danger of exploding, he said during an interview with LBS TV late Wednesday. Tahir said flagging the risk with authorities was extra work for him, and his predecessor is outside of his responsibility to prevent smuggling and collecting duties. He says it was the port authority's job to monitor the material and store it appropriately. So right now that kind of seems like he said, she said type of thing. Basically they're finger pointing at each other and they're not really necessarily wanting to take blame. I don't really think that that's uncommon, but they're not wanting to accept that one of them might have become wrong or maybe it was both of their faults. But either way, none of the officials are really necessarily wanting to take blame for the issue. The Russian ship was held at port after reporting technical problems, and inspectors spared it from sailing onwards. Owing the risk associated with retaining the ammonium nitrate on board the vessel, the port authorities discharged the cargo onto the port warehouse. Lawyers acting on behalf of creators wrote in 2015, according to the Post, the vessel and cargo remain to date in port awaiting auction and or proper disposal. The lawyer said the ship was abandoned by its owners after running out of supplies and the crew had eventually be retrabanded back to Russia because of immigration restrictions on prolonged stay in Beirut. The blast Tuesday, which appeared to have been caused by an accidental fire that ignited the warehouse that was full of ammonium nitrate, rippled across the Lebanese capital, causing widespread destruction. Losses from the blast are estimated to be between $10 billion to $15 billion. Beirut Governor Maureen Abad told the Saudi-owned TV station Al Hadid on Wednesday, adding that nearly 300,000 people are homeless. So, as of now, the Lebanese government is investigating the issue along with probably many other governments just to try to figure out exactly what has happened. And just like the situation earlier with the NRA, the investigation is very early on, so we don't know all of the facts, but we do know that this ship was talked about, or this storage place was talked about beforehand. And it is interesting to know that nothing exactly was done. And there also does seem to have some finger pointing going on with who actually is to blame, if not multiple people to be blamed for the explosion or for the lack of following rules or guidelines that might have been in place. And I thought a good transition article to the next couple of topics, because I do have a few solo topics before I get into a major topic to kind of end the show with, or at least get close to ending the show with, and that was Michelle Obama, so the former First Lady. There was a meme what became somewhat popular from all this COVID news going around about President Obama or former President Obama and President Trump and their mass illnesses they had to deal with, and it had numbers kind of side by side, and it kind of showed, depending on your perspective, of who handled their illness the best, or who handled their mass virus, or whatever you might want to call it, the best. But there was also a lot of news recently, or at least I think it was about 2, maybe 3 weeks ago. It was President Obama's birthday, so you had a lot of people saying happy birthday to President Obama and talking about how much better of a president he was compared to Trump. And that is kind of a side note to this whole topic, but that kind of brings me to the point of Michelle Obama, and she had some quotes to say that I caught my eye and I found rather interesting, and I didn't know exactly where to put it in the podcast, so I decided just to kind of stick it as a transition topic. And I'll just read it. Michelle Obama says she's suffering from low-grade depression, and this is by CNN and Allison Gordon. Former First Lady Michelle Obama says she's suffering from low-grade depression. The reasons? The pandemic, race relations in the U.S., and the political strife surrounding it all, she says. I'm waking up in the middle of the night. I am worrying about something, or there's a heaviness, Obama said in the Michelle Obama podcast on Wednesday. I tried to make sure I get a workout in, although there have been periods throughout this quarantine where I just have felt too low. It's a familiar feeling for many Americans. A Census Bureau survey found that 1 in 3 Americans are reporting symptoms of depression or anxiety, more than 3 times the rate from a similar survey conducted in the first half of 2019. And because one of the best ways to fight the coronavirus is through social distancing, people have gone long stretches of time without seeing their friends or family, exacerbating the already widespread problem of loneliness, which can be deeply harmful to one's mental health. In her podcast, Obama also discussed the racial reckoning in America following the death of George Floyd this summer. She explained it exhausting to be waking up yet another story of a black man or a black person somehow being dehumanized, or hurt, or killed, or falsely accused of something. She also discussed her frustration with people who refuse to wear masks. There's almost like there's a limit to our sacrifice, and that a month, and then we just got tired of the virus, she said. There has been disheartening to see so many people have gone tired of staying at home because the virus didn't impact them. Obama emphasized that while we have been through tough times in the nation before, we are in a unique moment in history. We are living through something that no one in our lifetime has lived through. So I'll stop here and I'll address the first thing she said about the quote at the top, where she's suffering from low-grade depression due to race relations in the U.S. and political strife, as well as COVID-19 and people not wearing their mask. So the whole thing with George Floyd isn't as black and white as it thought was going to be at first. And I kind of talked about it on really my first 2 podcasts, with my first podcast kind of being a stance that it was an outright murder, and I didn't really see much evidence to the contrary. And in the second episode, there was a leaked transcript of the audio between the police officer and George Floyd, and George Floyd seemed to be high on something, or at least not responding to the officers as well as a human should, or at least somebody within that stance should. And then there's been some body cam footage, and I haven't really got a chance to look at it too much. But either way, the George Floyd murder was wrong, but I don't think it was as simple as an outright brutal event we saw just from the one clip. But then again, it was an example of police brutality. I don't want that to get misconstrued, but I don't think it was just as simple as what it seemed to be at first. And many things aren't as simple as what they seem to be as first. So I don't think that that's very hard to understand when it comes to that. But due to Michelle Obama talking about how she's a little bit frustrated with people not wearing masks, it is an interesting issue. I know there's many people who are simply just not wanting to wear masks just because they don't see the point, and they see it more as like a government control or something the government wants you to do, yet there's little evidence of it actually working. Then you have a lot of people who are just wear their mask just because they're told to wear masks, kind of the sheeple, you could say. And those people think that you should wear a mask just because the government has told you. And then you have the people on the far side of that where have to wear a mask, and they want to make sure everyone else around them wears a mask as well because they think that it does A, B, C, D, E, F, G, blah, 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 blah. And that is why you have to wear a mask. And although this is just my example, and I don't think that it's fully happening around the world, but I do live in Texas, which is a very conservative state. And I also work at a grocery store. And in my grocery store, they require that you wear a mask, such as Walmart, Kroger, and other chains, all requiring that you must have a mask to enter. So a lot of customers have been wearing masks despite them not liking it. And I know many regular customers wear a mask and talk about how they don't like it when they come up to the cashier and we start checking them out. But a lot of people just don't see masks as being that important. And I do think that masks are simply there to provide a safety measure to people and so that they feel a little bit safer. But at the same time, a lot of people say that although they might not help entirely, they do help a little bit. Therefore, we should all wear masks. But going back to what I was originally saying in this point, I wanted to say through my example, and again, this may not be happening everywhere, but a lot of customers wear masks because maybe they have to, but they're still wearing masks. I would say a good probably 98% of customers are now wearing a mask. And I don't think that that's uncommon. And I do know that people are suggesting that you have to wear a mask, or you should wear a mask when you go work out, such as running outside or jogging or walking your dog or whatever. But that simply just doesn't make too much sense to me personally, although I know many people talk about how it does make sense. But I thought I would talk about that, and I thought I would talk about this as well before I move on, because I didn't really know when to put this in either the beginning or the end, so I decided to fit it here. But a lot of colleges are now moving online despite the option to meet in person. And I just learned today that my college has all gone online, although you are allowed to live on campus. So that is kind of strange that essentially you can live on campus in your dorm room, and I think have access to the library and other buildings that you might have access to if there wasn't this COVID going around. But all classes are physically done through online, so you're basically going to be at your college in your dorm room doing your class online. And I don't necessarily know how I feel about that. And they're also having, and I think every college is having a mask policy, man, that's hard to say. A mask policy where you have to wear your mask even inside or wherever else you might be, outside, whatever. You have to have your mask on at all times. And I'll read some of Ron's comments here, as he says, nothing short of a hazmat suit and proper decontamination will actually prevent the spread. Nobody's going to go for that. This is just safety theater, just like the security theater provided by the TCA. And I know you've made that point very clear from really every podcast I've had so far, and I know on Edge Channel and other events like it. And I don't think that you're necessarily wrong. I don't think that masks necessarily do too much besides provide people with something that makes them feel a little bit safer. But at the same time, you could argue that it's a good thing that it makes people feel safer. So I don't really know exactly where I align on the issue, but I do know that I don't necessarily like masks, but I don't necessarily view them as a control mechanism either, as I know other people, and I don't want to use your name and it not be you, Ron, but I do think that I do think that you're one of the people that simply doesn't wear a mask because they see it more as a control type of thing, and it doesn't help because you do need a hazmat suit to really be fully safe. And I don't think that you're necessarily wrong either. I do think that it's not as simple of a issue as it seems, as really any issue isn't as simple, as I've kind of talked about before. Alrighty, my next kind of solo topic, and then I have the Pope topic, and then we'll go on to some polling information and kind of the main thing I wanted to talk about in this episode of the podcast. And that is Facebook and Twitter and censorship, but morally relating to Donald Trump. Excuse me. So, Twitter has been a common thread when it comes to Donald Trump. Donald Trump has always been a controversial figure when it comes to Twitter. Most of the things he says and most of the things that get written about him on CNN and other type of networks, MSNBC, whatever else you want to name, Fox News, whatever, they most often get their information from Trump's Twitter. And Trump is no shy person of tweeting his thoughts, and he is very bullish in that factor. And that is a large part to why he got elected in the first place. But that's kind of a side note to what I'm talking about here, what I want to think about. So through Trump's and Twitter being vastly different from each other, and what I mean by that is the average person on Twitter, or the person that views Twitter, isn't a Trump fan. Okay, basically Twitter leadership isn't a Trump fan, and Trump is very popular on Twitter and has done midnight tweets, and even when he first ran and it became his campaign and wasn't a president, there is a lot of articles written about how his campaign managers were wanting to take his phone away so he couldn't tweet, but he still tweet because he was Donald Trump. So a lot of, again, what comes out of Trump is through Twitter and not necessarily his policies or what he says on his press conferences, but through Twitter. And Twitter isn't necessarily a fan of Donald Trump as a whole organization. So a lot of people were interested to see what Twitter is going to do with censorship relating to the president. It is very hard for a company to fully censor the president of the United States of America. That would be an absolutely huge issue when it comes to that information. So I was on the sidelines thinking about, obviously, Twitter leadership doesn't really like Donald Trump and what he tweets. So what are they going to do about censoring Donald Trump if they want to? Are they even going to censor Donald Trump despite the outrageous things they think he says and other people think he says? So Twitter came out with something that was rather interesting, and that was they have a information page or an information tab that comes up on what Donald Trump says. So if Donald Trump is talking about coronavirus and quoting case numbers and saying, it's not as bad as we think, and comparing it to another epidemic or similar flu or common flu that we experience in the U.S. every year, a little eye will come up and it quotes a CDC claim or some claim out there that Twitter thinks is valid to what President Trump is talking about. So that is how Twitter has decided to kind of censor what Donald Trump says. And sometimes on what he quotes, you have to be a person of a certain age to view the actual tweet, despite what the content of the tweet actually being not something where it really should be age restricted per se. But that's all up to personal viewpoints. But Twitter has made an effort to kind of at least have an extra step to where you have to view Donald Trump's tweets on some things he has to say. And I'll quickly read Ron's comment before I get into the article kind of talking about this. As Ron says, I think to make the mask work better, they should be grouped as they are... I think to make the mask work better, they should be groped as they enter the store. Yeah, I think that would be it. I think that's actually a great idea. That's a great idea. I think it would ensure safety because you have to sanitize your hands when you enter the store. So you have to sanitize your buttocks when you enter the store as well. I do think that makes sense. I think that you should email your local Walmart about that. But going to the article by CBS, it says Facebook and Twitter removed a video of Trump falsely claiming children almost immune to the coronavirus. Facebook and Twitter announced Wednesday that they have removed a video of President Trump shared on his Facebook page and Twitter account because it contained false claims about the coronavirus. The video was a clip of a phone interview of Mr. Trump did with Fox News on Wednesday morning, in which he pushed for schools to reopen for in-person learning and falsely claimed children are almost immune to the virus. The video includes false claims that a group of people is immune from the COVID-19, which is a violation for our policies around harmful COVID misinformation, a spokesperson for Facebook said. A Twitter spokesperson also confirmed the video is in violation of Twitter rules on the COVID-19 misinformation and added that at Team Trump, the official Twitter account for Mr. Trump's campaign, would not be able to tweet again until they delete the tweet of the video. In the clip, this which was tweeted by the Trump campaign and shared on Mr. Trump's personal Twitter account, the president repeated his demand that schools reopen in the fall. If you look at children are almost, and I would almost say definitely, but almost immune from this disease, Mr. Trump said. A recent study from South Korea suggests that children between the ages of 0 and 9 may spread the disease to a lesser degree than adults, but the study showed children aged 10 to 19 can spread the coronavirus at least as well as adults can. And the article goes on to talk a little bit more about the details of President Trump's claim and why it is false. But it isn't really the thing I wanted to talk about in this point or in this perspective of this topic. Excuse me. And that is basically censoring Donald Trump. It's a very interesting concept, and I don't think that it's necessarily very smart for these mass media, or not really mass media, but social media companies. And you could say that they're mass media, and I'm not going to get bogged down with that. But basically, it would seem that they're trying to find any way possible to try to censor President Trump and what he says. And you could argue that that's good when it's relating to COVID-19 information, because more people are getting persuaded with COVID-19 through fear mass media websites and mass media videos and mass media companies trying to get you to be fearful of the virus so that you listen to them and their information. And obviously getting good information about COVID-19 is very important, because good information is how you're able to live your life and be able to have an impact and be able to move forward and hopefully end the virus sooner than later. And misinformation is something that should be avoided, but at the same time, you have freedom of speech, and freedom of speech is very important. And what's kind of shocking to me is that they're willing to censor President Trump over misinformation, in air quotes, over COVID-19. Yes, he's the president, so whatever the president says does get more attention than the average Joe who might tweet something that isn't 100% true or lying or is misinformation, as they use there. But the perspective of what Trump says and what you get from his quote is important and should be heard. And the fact that they're willing to ban Donald Trump's campaign and his whole team from tweeting any tweet afterward is very, very shocking. I think shows the clear motive that Twitter has and what Facebook has towards President Trump and towards his people and people that agree with President Trump, or at least follow President Trump. You don't have to be a President Trump fan to kind of see what Twitter is doing here as being politically motivated. And I don't think that is necessarily smart, and is something that even with President Trump and being such a controversial figure, or at least such a talked about figure in mass media, it's very bizarre to see that they're actually willing to go towards censorship. So, the Pope. This is a topic I've been wanting to think about a little bit, and I mentioned at the beginning of my podcast, but I didn't want to really spoil the beans before I got to it. But I'll just read the article, and this is from The Guardian. Pope appoints 6 women to top roles on a Vatican Council in progressive step. Pope Francis has appointed 6 women to oversee the Vatican's finances, including Ruth Kelly, the former labor minister, in the most senior roles ever given to a woman within the Catholic Church's leadership. The appointments mark the most significant step by Francis to fulfill his promise of placing women in top positions. Until now, the 15-member Council for the Economy was all male. By statute, the council must include 8 bishops, who are always men, and 7 lay people. That 6 are women is a pretty big quota, said Joshua McLean, the Vatican correspondent for the National Catholic Reporter. But an important thing here is that the 6 women are part of a group that essentially oversees all the financial activities of the Vatican. So obviously that's a pretty top-level group. The female appointees are all European and have high-profile financial backgrounds. Leslie Fier, a former treasurer to Prince Charles, is the other British woman among the team. The 2 women are Catherine Krieger, Christoph and Madre, both from Germany, and Maria, Oscar and Eva, both from Spain. The only layman on the council is Alberto Menia, a former director general at the Generali, the Italian insurance company. The appointees came as the Vatican struggles with its finances, with problems worsened by the coronavirus pandemic and sharp drop in the number of visitors of the Vatican museums, a cash flow for the Holy See. Francis created the Council for Economy in 2014. It is essential the board of surveillance for everything financial within the Vatican, with the only person above it being Pope Francis, said McLeave. Other women have opted prominent positions during Francis' papacy include Barba, who helps with the Vatican museums, and Francia, the undersecretary of the Vatican Secretariat of State. Kelly, 52, was an economist correspondent for The Guardian for 4 years in the 1990s and went on to hold a number of cabinet positions and ministerial positions in Labour government under Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, holding up the Departments of Education, Transport and Communities, and Local Government. In the latter role, she was also the women's minister. And it goes on to talk a little bit more about the women who have these positions. And as I was talking about a little bit earlier, Pope Francis is a somewhat of a controversial figure within the Catholic faith. He is very much a conservative type of candidate or conservative person compared to previous popes or previous leadership of the Catholic Church. He's more of a progressive type of pope, and he said a lot of things kind of not necessarily pro-LGBT, but at least pro-ish LGBT, as obviously the Catholic Church isn't for gay marriage, but he said very pro things about the LGBT movement as a whole organization, kinda. And you can kind of look into some of the quotes he said about it as a whole, but I do know a lot of people in the Catholic faith aren't so much a fan of Pope Francis, and obviously appointing these women to his council or to higher positions isn't something that is ultimately bad, but it does seem to be a moment that he's really been pushing for, because it does say that he wanted to have more women in leadership. And again, that's not necessarily bad. I don't want that to get misconstrued or anything, but it is interesting to see if that was his only motive and if his reasons were political to get the left off his back and off the Catholic Church after their latest scandal and what happened from there. And obviously I don't know too much about Pope Francis' motives with that, but I do know that he's not necessarily a candidate that all Catholics do agree with, though he is the head leadership of the Catholic Church. And I'll take a quick drink break and we'll move on to the next topic. Squad member. I laugh every time I hear the word squad in reference to AOC, Rashida Tlaib, and others. But anyway, I'll continue. Squad member Rashida Tlaib defeats primary challenger Brianda Jones, CNN Projects. Again, this is by CNN, by Claire Foran. Freshman Democrat Representative Rashida Tlaib of Michigan has prevailed against a Democratic primary challenger from Detroit City Council President Breakdown Jones. In Michigan's 13th congressional district, Tlaib faced a rematch in Tuesday night Democratic primary against Jones, who beat her once before to serve out the remainder of the former Representative John Cornier's term, but lost to Tlaib in the first full-term election for the seat in heavily Democratic district. As a member of the So Progressive Squad, Tlaib, who made history in 2018 along with Minnesota Representative Ilhan Elmore, as the first two Muslim women ever to serve in Congress, has a number of built-in advantages as she runs for re-election, including high name recognition, the ability to raise significant amounts of money, and a devoted national following at the same time. However, Tlaib has faced controversy over some outside the mainstream political positions and at times has faced criticism, including from Democrats, over statements related to Israel. I feel a really good chance of actually winning and returning back to my seat to represent the people of the 13th Congressional District, Jones told CNN in an interview in June. Jones describes herself as a centrist Democrat, saying, "I don't consider myself to be far to the left. I don't consider myself to be far to the right." In the 2018 special election, after Congress resigned, Jones won against Tlaib in a 4-candidate Democratic primary. However, Tlaib nearly won out against Jones in a 6th Democrat primary held at the same time to determine who would serve the next full term for congressional district. Jones lost by fewer than 1,000 votes in the race. And it goes on to talk a little bit more about Jones and Rashida Tlaib. But ultimately, we know who won. And I thought that was rather interesting because at one point it was a potential race for her to lose due to her political stance and some political issues relating to what she said again about Israel and other components. But now we'll get into kind of the main topic I wanted to mention in my podcast, and that is Biden versus Trump. So obviously this is going to be an ongoing topic from podcast to podcast, but it is interesting to kind of talk about poll numbers when it comes to Biden versus Trump. But before we get into the polls, I wanted to read this article from ABC News about Biden. Biden will no longer travel to DNC to accept Democratic nomination aimed pandemic. Former Vice President Joe Biden and the rest of the planned conviction speakers will not travel to Wisconsin for the Quadrennial Democratic National Convention, according to a release from its committee Wednesday, citing health concerns with ongoing coronavirus pandemic. After ongoing consultation with the public health officials and experts who understand the worsening coronavirus pandemic, the Democratic National Convention Committee announced Tuesday speakers for the 2020 Democratic National Convention will no longer travel to Milwaukee, Wisconsin in order to prevent risking the health of the host community as well as the convention's production teams, security officials, community partners, media, and other necessary to orchestrate the event, the release said. Biden, who has scheduled to accept the party's nomination in the key battleground state on August 20th, will now accept a nominee from Delaware. In accordance with the guidance, Vice President Joe Biden will no longer travel to Milwaukee and will instead address the nation and accept a Democratic nomination from his home state of Delaware. Details about the location of the speech will be released at a later time. Other speakers who have been planning to come to Milwaukee will not travel to the city, the announcement continued. Less than 2 weeks out, the sudden change to the convention in an event that historically takes years to plan and is capstone of the party's nomination process that typically attracts thousands of supporters and party loyalists has effectively been reduced to an entirely virtual affair. From the very beginning of this pandemic, we put the health and safety of the American people first. We followed the science, listened to doctors and public health officials, and we continued making adjustments to our plans in order to protect lives. That's kind of the steady and responsible leadership America deserves, and it's the leadership Joe Biden will bring to the White House, Democratic National Committee Chair Tom Pierre said in a statement along with an announcement. And again, the article goes on to talk a little bit about more, but it kind of repeats some of the information we've already heard, or at least would think about when it relates to this information. But the main thing I wanted to mention in this is the fact that Basement Biden seems to be the common theme, and is obviously the title of the podcast. As I say, Basement Biden might be winning. And what I mean by Basement Biden, before I go on to the next part in relating to polling information, is they essentially right now are seeming to want to keep Biden under grasp and not have too many public appearances or even online appearances much at all. Right now, the coronavirus is taking up all of the mainstream media news effort, and all we hear about is coronavirus for whatever reason you might think that is. But in a large part, I think they're using coronavirus as a method to control the flow of mass media and what we hear about, or in other words, to control what we hear about in the news in order to hide Biden and what he might be saying throughout this information. Obviously, it's important we get to hear what Biden thinks about the coronavirus, as he is a presidential candidate, and they are doing that through tweets and his brief appearances when he does go online on his virtual town halls or his virtual events. But at the same time, they want to keep him out of the mainstream as much as possible. We all know that Biden is a gaffe machine, and these gaffes do make for troublesome events to happen. And I do think that the DNC, or at least the average Democrat, or at least somebody of Joe Biden's campaign staff, is taking the approach of the more Biden doesn't talk, the better off he is. In other words, the more the coronavirus exists in the news network, the more we don't have to show Joe Biden. And through being Basement Biden, or being somebody who doesn't really talk much or doesn't really come out and say much, and be kind of the average Joe, the candidate that is very much opposite of Trump but isn't as bad as Hillary, he might win the election just off of that. And it's a very big point, and I think it is a point that is getting pushed within Joe Biden's campaign, and I do think is a somewhat smart strategy. Now, obviously, you can believe that polls aren't 100% right, and polls I have largely thought to be something that shouldn't necessarily be fully relied on, because I don't think that they really give a full perspective to every issue. But at the same time, polls can give a slight perspective to who might have the edge, or at least who we should be looking at as a whole event. And one of the big points of Joe Biden versus Trump is who's going to get the minority votes. Now, obviously, Joe Biden has had a big push for black votes and is a candidate that generally thinks he has black support. Obviously, the Democratic Party is very much aligned with blacks as a population. And what I mean by that is they seem to push their political motives, or what they strive to be, towards a minority group such as blacks. And it seems to be a strategy to win the votes of black people. And obviously, you could say that is not 100% true, but at the same time, it does seem to have a common history within past elections. And Joe Biden has said so himself, that he thinks he has black support. And I'll go on to read the article from The Hill by J. Edward Moreno. Young minority voters show overwhelming support for Biden. Minority voters between the ages of 18 and 34 are showing overwhelming support for former Vice President Joe Biden, the presumptive Democratic presidential nominee, in a national poll released by BuzzFeed. Oh, BuzzFeed. The poll found 60% of young Latino voters, 75% of young non-Hispanic black voters, and 72% of young non-Hispanic Asian voters said that they would vote for Biden. Respectively, 19%, 12%, and 16% of respondents in these groups said that they would vote or re-elect President Trump. Among young, non-Hispanic white voters, 40% said they would vote for Trump and 48% said that they would vote for Biden. The gap between the two candidates when it comes to who young Latino voters believe will win the election is much narrower with just a 1% difference between Biden and Trump. The survey also found that 64% of young Latino voters said that they would definitely vote in the upcoming election. Half of the young Latinos polled are registered Democrats, 13% are Republicans, and 30% are independents are not sure. Latinos make up a significant portion of the population in several key swing states, such as Florida and Arizona. During the Democratic primary, Senator Bernie Sanders performed well among young Latinos, outperforming Biden in Arizona and Nevada. The poll found that 1 in 10 Latino and Black voters believe their decision will be key in November. The poll also asked young Latino voters to name a politician who has shown up for the Latino community. And it goes on to talk about some, but I don't think that is entirely informative to the topic of hand and what I wanted to talk about here. And I see Ron with the sticker party on YouTube. I appreciate that. Normally it's D-Live, but you have to do what you have to do. And I'm not really talking about COVID. Don't worry, Ron. That was just a brief mention, because I do think, as I was saying earlier, that there does seem to be an overwhelming motive, or at least a large motive to drown out what Biden has to say, or at least limit Biden's appearances in order to keep him as the average Joe or the average person to vote for when it comes to the actual election in 3 months. And I'll go on to this next article by CNN, where it talks about how Trump's position might have stabilized. And this is by Harry Eaton. There is little doubt that the former vice president, Joe Biden, has upper hand against Donald Trump at this point. Biden has led in poll after poll nationally and in almost every poll in the core 6 battleground states: Arizona, Florida, Michigan, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. Yet while Biden has maintained advantage, Trump has one thing going for him. His position is no longer deteriorating. A look at polls shows that even as coronavirus cases and deaths rise, Trump remains within striking distance of Biden. An Iowa poll out of Wednesday from Mammoth University makes this point well. Trump comes in with 48% to Biden's 45%, a 3-point margin, and a result within the poll's margin of error. Trump won Iowa by more than 9 points in 2016. That equates to a 6-point swing towards Biden from the 2016 result, which is good for the Democrat. However, that's not much better and perhaps a touch worse than you would have seen earlier this summer. A Des Moines Register poll from the state early June gave Trump 44 to Biden's 43%, another within the margin of error. This poll, however, was a swing of 8 points from the 2016 result. When you look at the average state poll that called cell phones, you see no sign that Trump is doing worse than in early summer. In an advantage state poll in June, Biden outperformed Hillary Clinton's margin by 8 points. The margin was 8 points since July as well. This would translate to a 10-point Biden lead nationally. This is better than Biden was doing earlier in the year, when a similar exercise suggested he was up around 7 or 8 points nationally. Still, any momentum Biden seemed to have in June has stopped. Essentially, Biden wideside his advantage from May to June following the beginning of the protests after George Floyd's killing in late May, and it has not gotten worse for Trump since. The national polling paints a similar picture. Biden's margin widened at the end of May and beginning of June. Since then, Trump has held his ground. Biden was ahead of Trump by 11 points in the average national poll that called cell phones June. The margin was exactly the same in July. Likewise, the average of other polls was an 8-point Biden advantage in June and an 8-point Biden advantage in July. Poll aggregators take that into account of data that actually Trump cutting his defect from around 10 points to somewhere close to the 7 to 9. That's better than when Biden was before June, but less than his peak. The same trend can be seen in Trump's overall job approval rating. His declined prosperity from April to June. The drop accelerated at the end of May. And talks a little bit about more and quotes a little bit more numbers. But essentially, this article is talking about that Trump was continuously getting worse in polls as Biden was getting better. But now these worse polls have started to become less. So in other words, Trump is now either climbing or become stable. And through him becoming stable or climbing, there could pose an impact to Biden's lead and at least what he's had before, as the perspective of the public might be changing due to his COVID-19 coverage or whatever else you might want to talk about from there. But this next one, our article in the last one talking about polling before we end the podcast with the last topic, is from 538. And as I said in multiple videos, and I think in every podcast that I've covered the election so far, 538 was the most accurate polling live during the election, at least last presidential election cycle. But the big thing was that how inaccurate the polls were back then in that election, and that Hillary Clinton was actually winning despite Trump actually winning the overall election. And obviously polls only give a certain sample size, so they don't show necessarily the whole outcome of what you want them to show, yet the perspective of the poll, or at least the poll's motive, might be to show it. But at the same time, it is hard to replicate something like that and it be 100% true. But long story short, although the pollings were inaccurate and had Hillary Clinton winning, polls are still something that should be looked at. And there are several YouTubers, including Don't Stop Run Productions, who I've cited before, and I highly suggest you checking out his channel. Our Actual Justice Warrior has also talked about it a little bit on his channel. But essentially, the national pollings were actually somewhat accurate, despite everyone thinking they were not. So polling is something that I'm considering looking at a little bit more than what I have in the past. But before I blabber on, I'll read this article. Biden is polling better than Hillary Clinton at her peak. Election day is now just 3 months away, and the overall of the race hasn't changed much recently. Joe Biden continues to hold a sizable lead over President Trump. Biden is now by 8 percentage points in 538's national polling average, and has an advantage of 5 points or more in several key battleground states like Florida, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. Faced with these numbers, though, a lot of people, Republicans, Democrats, and people with no particular party affiliation, raise a reasonable question: wasn't Hillary Clinton leading in the polls too? Well, yes, but not quite like this. We compared Biden's standing to where Hillary Clinton was at this point in the polls 4 years ago. We especially chose the point in the cycle in 2016 because this is where Hillary Clinton hit her peak on August 7th, following the Democratic National Convention. Clinton had a 7.5 lead over Trump in national polls. Clinton never topped that lead, but as you can see in the chart below, even at her convention peak, Clinton's lead over Trump still wasn't as large as Biden is now. This means that the sizable advantage Biden currently holds isn't the product of the convention, instead of sugar high, but rather the larger electoral environment, which is very poor for Trump. There's no guarantee Biden's lead will hold. It's hard to know that the post-convention bounces will look like this. This year, for example, given that there are remote affairs and scheduled back-to-back. But Biden seems to be starting from a better baseline than Clinton. Critically, he enjoys a higher level of average support than Hillary Clinton did. That was another thing about Hillary Clinton in the last presidential race. Hillary Clinton wasn't necessarily someone that a lot of people liked. So that's something a lot of people have to think about. A lot of people decided to vote for Trump just because they didn't like Hillary Clinton, or they wanted to vote for a businessman rather than a politician. Now that we know who Trump is, Trump may not have that edge as he had before in the last presidential election. But a lot of people, and I mean a lot of people, voted for Trump just because they hated Hillary Clinton more than Trump. It was essentially the best of two evils. But I'll continue. Clinton led in the most national polls, but was typically garnering support only in the low to mid-40s. Biden's share has been hovering around 50%. As a result, some of the uncertainty around the strategy of Trump-Biden's race might be reduced, in part because there are simply fewer voters who haven't made up their minds, and because signs point to fewer third-party votes in 2016. Combined, Clinton and Trump had secured 84% of the support on average in the national polls in August 2016. By comparison, Biden and Trump currently combine for 92%. Those are good for Biden at the state level, too. Just as he does nationally, Biden enjoys more overall support than Clinton in each of the battleground states we looked at. But there are a couple of significant caveats. As the chart below shows, there are several key states where Biden's margin against Trump is actually lower than Clinton was at the point in 2016. And it kind of cites one where Biden has more support in Texas, Arizona, Nevada, Colorado, Virginia, Maine, New Hampshire, and Florida, but has worse support in Ohio, Wisconsin, Iowa, Pennsylvania, Minnesota, Michigan, Georgia, North Carolina, and New Mexico. And it has a couple more paragraphs if you want to read the article in whole, but I do think it proves the point to what I was mentioning earlier. And I do think that basement Biden, at least if you believe polls, is winning against Trump. And I do think that their strategy of kind of hiding Biden and let this mass media coverage of coronavirus or other major events and keep Joe Biden quiet as much as possible is potentially winning. The last thing Joe Biden could do is have a gaffe or multiple gaffes and people question his mental health more than they already are. Because mental health and concern of the president and how he or she, but they're both he, but anyway, how they might be able to handle their concerns of health is an actual concern Americans do use when they go to vote. You can ask the average American, and most likely when you have them list what they want their president to be or something they look for when they go to vote, health is going to be one of those concerns. And although both men are rather old, Joe Biden does seem to have a little bit more of a health issue than Donald Trump, at least when it comes to mental cognitive abilities. So by them not having to talk and by him hiding those mental cognitive abilities is something that I do think seems to be working towards their favor so far in this election. And basement Biden might actually be winning if you do believe polls. And obviously polls do have their issues, as Hillary Clinton was winning in polls, yet President Trump is our president. But this last topic is something I just wanted to quickly end with, and it's something I think is rather interesting and rather concerning at the same time. California increases early inmate release estimated aimed at pandemic. Sacramento, California. State prison officials say as many as 17,600 California inmates may be released early due to coronavirus, 70% more than the previously estimated in total that victims and police say includes dangerous criminals who would stay locked up. The release also are cautioning concentration as probation officers and community organizations scramble to provide housing, transportation, and other services for inmates who may serve as a public health risk because several hundred have been paroled while still contagious. It has been total madhouse, quite frankly, and we are doing this in the midst of a pandemic, said Karen McDaniel, the statewide transportation and service liaison between community groups and correction officials. Among those released was Tree Bree Williams, 44, who served 19 years of an 84 years to life for first-degree murder, carjacking, and kidnapping. She was also freed last week after being demanded a high medical risk for the virus. Williams' victim Kevin John Ripske picked her up to drive her to work in 1998, but the pair argued and Williams forced him into the trunk of his own car at gunpoint. She shot him and he tried to escape. Then he brought the wounded man more than 700 miles from Tecumseh, Washington to a motel, Davis, California. There she gagged him and tied him to a chair. He died from an infected wound. Why is this inmate's rights more important than his victims? Said an outraged sister. You have let out community attorney Jeff Reesick, whose office prosecuted Williams, and an advocacy group, Crime Victims Alliance, complained that victims and prosecutors are given little notice and no opportunity to object to the release. The virus is spread by coughs and sneezes and quickly can sweep through a prison setting. So far, 51 inmates have died, and there have been more than 8,400 cases among prisoners. Nearly 2,000 statewide system employees also had 8 have died. The latest, Sergeant McGinney Lee, who worked at Williams State in Chakadwala, officials have been under the intense pressure from advocates, some state lawmakers, and 2 federal judges to release more inmates, particularly after a botched transfer of infected inmates into San Quer State Prison led to state's worst prison outbreak. Nearly 170 inmates still affected, and there are 23 dead, including 11 on death row. More than 2,000 have either recovered or were released while infected. Demonstrators who chained themselves to a fence outside Governor Gavin Newsom's home last week said he was prescribed over dozens of preventable deaths in state prison by not freeing far more inmates. The first 3,500 inmates were freed in April to create space in crowded prisons, and 6,900 more were demanded eligible for release in early June. Officials said that other inmates would be eligible under different releases programs but couldn't provide an estimate. In a filing last week with a federal judge who oversees one of the major lawsuits facing the prison system, officials increased the estimated total of release from 10,400 to 17,600. However, prison officials say Corrections Secretary Ralph Diaz is likely to break the release of about 5,500, in part because many are serving life prison sentences. It goes on to talk a little bit about more California and their plan to release prisoners, but it's a general open discussion and something I've thought about, and the ethical stance of inmates and the prison system in relating to the virus. As the article kind of talked about in some of its numbers, it is a very prime environment for coronavirus to exist and spread through the prison and ultimately contaminate a lot of the prisoners within its walls. But at the same time, releasing high-stake prisoners isn't necessarily an issue that has been worked very well. In New York, when it was done, a lot of crime rates have gone up. I don't have the statistics now, but I'm thinking about on my next podcast kind of talking a little bit about the statistics and a little bit more about releasing inmates with this pandemic and its response to hopefully not allow as many deaths within the prison walls that could have possibly been prevented, in air quotes. But it is a very ethical issue on what governors and what should happen within prisoners. Low-risk prisoners might get released, but at the same time, what defines low risk? And if high-risk prisoners get released and car thefts go up, crime goes up, murders go up, whatever else, sexual assaults go up or whatever, that is an issue that is directly involving the public that you're prescribed to trust. So in other words, if you release these prisoners and more crime happens just because of the coronavirus, are you really doing something that is ethically right compared to just hopefully saving more prisoners' lives due to this epidemic and it being so easily spread within the prison walls? But I'll read Ron's comment here. I find it hard to believe that Biden is in the lead, seeing that at the same time media who told us that Clinton had it in the bag. See, that's a big thing about polls, and that's why there really should be a question mark on my title about Basement Biden winning, because I don't necessarily think that polls should be 100% trusted, but at the same time, a lot of YouTubers and a lot of people I trust more than just the mass media do think that there is something to somewhat be concerned about compared to last presidential election. I don't think that President Trump has it in the bag to win an election even against Joe Biden, but at the same time I would find it hard to believe if Joe Biden is actually in the lead if you were somehow to be able to get everyone's perspective on who they're going to vote for before the vote actually happens. But that is the end of today's podcast, and I appreciate all of your comments with Ron, Ed, and John and others, and I appreciate Rod the follow on DLive, and I'm going to be having my live stream of my book either tomorrow or over the weekend. I'm unsure exactly when I'm going to do it because I do have work tomorrow. So I'm thinking about doing it before work, but I can't promise that I'm going to do it then. So those who are listening to the podcast now will probably be on my YouTube, DLive, and Twitch by the time you get to hear it. With those who are listening right now, it's most likely probably going to be on the weekend, as I can't necessarily promise it happening tomorrow, but I am going to have an update on my book and what I've done so far with it, or at least my chapter. It's not really a book so far yet. But again, I highly appreciate you joining my live stream. I really appreciate your comments, and I hope you'll listen to the podcast later. Or those who are listening to the podcast now, I appreciate you as well. And again, you could find my podcast on Apple, Spotify, Anchor, whatever, SoundCloud, wherever you might find your podcast. I'm probably there. And I highly appreciate you checking me out, and I hope you'll listen next time. And I do have several solo videos that I'm planning to release on my YouTube channel really, really soon. But hopefully I'll get those finished before the next podcast. So I'll see you on the next one. And again, I appreciate all of you.